Final Fantasy XIV is a game with an ever-increasing number of jobs, all of which you're able to play on a single character, and as a result, leveling is a big part of playing 14, as you're more than likely going to want to try many of the different jobs available, especially when they release new ones. And so here's everything you need to know to help with the leveling process. Now, before you actually begin leveling, there are a few things you're going to want to know about. The first of which is the different mechanics that affect your experience gain, such as the armory bonus, rested experience, and the preferred world buff. Starting with the armory bonus, which is a buff designed to help you level your other jobs, as it grants a bonus 100% experience that later drops to 50% for the last 10 levels to all jobs that are a lower level than your current highest level job. Meaning, if you have a job that is max level, every other job you level afterwards will have a massive experience boost until they too are max level. After the armory bonus, we have rested experience, another passive buff that you're able to accumulate by logging out in sanctuaries, which is basically any area with an aetheryte or that lets you log out without having to wait 20 seconds. By doing this, your experience bar will progressively fill with rested experience that, much like the armory bonus, provides you a rather large EXP buff at 50% until you've used all the rested experience you've accumulated. And lastly, we have the preferred world buff, also known as the Road to X buff. The buff changes depending on what the max level is, which is by far the strongest EXP buff in the game. As unlike the other buffs that mostly increase battle experience, the preferred world buff increases all experience sources by 100%. However, the catch to this buff is you have to create a character on a preferred world, which means it's mostly something that only new players are really going to be taking advantage of. As for how you find out if a world is preferred, I'll have a link in the description to the 14 server statuses, and if you see a world that says preferred or new, that means you'll receive the buff for creating your character on that world. After experience mechanics, we have experience consumables and gear. Starting with the consumables, the easiest to access is always going to be food. You see, every food item found in the game provides you a small 3% battle experience bonus, with the only exceptions being the occasional promotional food that gives a bonus 4% instead. And while 3 or 4% may not seem like much, that bonus does add up over time. Plus, there's no shortage of food items, as they're often given as quest rewards, or they can easily be bought from generic vendors. But after the easy food buffs, we have the more difficult to obtain battle manuals. These are items that, once used, grant you a bonus 15% battle experience buff for 2 hours, and the only way to obtain them is by progressing your grand company until the point you gain access to squadrons, at which point you'll have to progress your squadron until the point you're able to run priority missions, which are the missions that will give you the various buffing items such as the battle manuals. And unfortunately, this is a somewhat confusing process to the point that it might need its own guide. However, on the bright side, there is a decent alternative, as the battle manuals are essentially the solo variant of the free company EXP buff. In fact, as far as I know, the two don't actually stack, which means if you don't want to worry about squadrons, you can always just join a free company, as most tend to run the battle buff. Though that being said, it's usually the 10% variant, as it's more accessible than the 15%. Moving on to the final way to boost your experience gain, we have experience gear. Now, there isn't actually that many gear items found in game that boost experience. In fact, there are only 2 that can be obtained purely from the game. Those being the brand new ring that gives you a bonus 30% while under level 30 that you get from completing the Hall of Novices, and the Boston earring, which we'll touch upon a little later, that gives you a bonus 10% while under level 80. Other than those 2, however, the only other major EXP boosting items are the earrings you'll get from pre-ordering the various expansions, which usually will give you a bonus 30% until you're 10 levels before max, and unlike the Boston earring, you can wear them from level 1 and their stats will change as you go through the levels, meaning they'll last you throughout your leveling process. Now, the last thing that I want to quickly talk about that kind of falls into this category of experience boosting mechanics and items is the Wondrous Tales, which is an item unlocked in Heavensward that you're able to obtain each week, and upon using it from the key items page, it will open up a bingo sheet that you're able to fill out by doing various pieces of content. And depending on the number of lines you get, you'll receive more rewards. However, for the purposes of leveling, the most important reward is simply turning in the completed book back to the NPC, as this will always reward you half a level for whatever job you turn it in on, making it a fantastic source of weekly experience. But with the different EXP mechanics and buffs explained, let's get into the actual leveling process. So when it comes to the leveling process, you kind of have to split tanks and healers from the DPS, as the damage dealers are always going to have a harder time getting into content when compared to their support allies. And so with that being the case, we're going to cover them separately. And naturally, we're going to begin with the DPS, as the leveling process for them is a bit more involved. So to start off, let's state the obvious. The best source of experience you'll have access to each day is your roulettes. And so no matter what role you're leveling, these should always be your top priority. Specifically, leveling frontline, trials, alliance raids, and MSQ, as these are the ones with the best experience per your time invested. And do not, and I repeat, do not neglect frontlines. While yes, it is PvP, it's also the second best roulette for experience after leveling, so by not doing it, you really are missing out, especially if you're leveling DPS, as unlike the other roulettes, your role won't affect your queue time. Also, an important note about the frontline roulette is the job that you queue in with is the one that gets the experience, and this is important to know because you're actually able to change your job once you get inside, meaning you can play something that you enjoy more. You don't actually have to play the job that you're leveling. Now, outside your daily roulettes, the best way to level for the first 60 levels is going to be the first deep dungeon, Palace of the Dead, which is a procedurally generated dungeon with roguelike elements and an independent leveling system. Now, to unlock Palace of the Dead, you first have to progress the MSQ and reach level 17, at which point you'll be able to do the quest The House That Death Built, which unlocks Palace. And while you have to be level 17 to unlock it, you can actually go in at any level, including level 1. Though, for the first 15 levels, you're usually better off just completing your chosen job's hunting log and doing their job quests. But getting back to Palace of the Dead, there are a couple things we need to cover. First is, how does it work? Well, by talking to this NPC, you're able to enter the dungeon, which actually creates a save file that records your progress, as the actual goal of these deep dungeons is to reach the end without your party wiping. And if you ever find that for some reason you're not able to enter the dungeon, the chances are you don't have an open slot, meaning you'll have to delete one of your save files to make room. Once you actually get in, you'll have to start at floor 1 and then progress to floor 10, where you'll fight a boss. Afterwards, you'll leave like any other dungeon, getting some experience in your progress saved, meaning that instead of starting at floor 1, you'll go back in at floor 11, where you'll just repeat the process until eventually you reach floor 50 and unlock the one and only checkpoint, which will allow you to actually start from floor 51 instead of floor 1. And this is where the leveling part of Palace of the Dead comes into play, because something else that is important to know about deep dungeons is they don't have role or party restrictions, meaning you can go in with 4 DPS, you can go in with 3 DPS, or you can just go in by yourself. It doesn't care about party comp in the slightest. And because of this, what people tend to do is queue from the checkpoint to run floors 51 to 60 over and over again to level, as the experience gain is basically on par with spamming dungeons, at least until you get into the 50s, at which point it's going to slow pretty significantly to the point that you're going to have to start doing Heavensward dungeons, which unfortunately is the best way of leveling for Heavensward. Though on the bright side, you can now do duty support to get into dungeons instantly, but unfortunately that's always going to be slower than doing it with real people, as that's an actual game mechanic, so levels 51 to 60 just kind of suck. Thankfully, this isn't going to be an issue when you actually get into the 60s, as Stormblood introduced the second deep dungeon, Heaven on High, and like Palace, this is going to be your go-to method until level 71, at which point you'll gain access to Bozja. That is after you complete a couple of quest lines, specifically Return to Ivlis, the Alliance raids for Stormblood, which have to be completed in order to start Hail to the Queen, which is the quest line that eventually unlocks Bozja. Speaking of which, what is Bozja? Well, to put it simply, it's essentially a 7th zone for Shadowbringers that, unlike the normal zones, you have to actually queue into, and it has its own mechanics and gimmicks while inside. For example, there are items called Forgotten Fragments that you can redeem for special actions or buffs. And remember how we said we were going to talk about the Bosnian earring later? Well, you're actually able to get that earring by redeeming these fragments. Specifically, you have to redeem 1,000 of them. It's also important to note that the earring actually gives you a bonus buff while inside Bozja. But that aside, let's move on to actually leveling with Bozja. So the main gimmick of these zones is you're able to kill the robot enemies to spawn fates that reward an absurd amount of experience for how much time you actually invest. And that's just for the normal fates. There's also the critical engagements, which are boss fights that you have to opt into and that only spawn after specific fates have been completed. And doing these will usually reward you somewhere around double to triple the experience of normal fates. In fact, the XP gain from Bozja is so great that it's not only on par or better than dungeon spam, but it remains that way until level 90. And even then, it's not exactly a horrible option. Now, something else that we should actually be doing outside of Bozja getting into Shadowbringers, however, is our daily beast tribes, or as they're now known, allied societies. And while these have been around since ARR, it's only now that they really start to become worth it from an experience standpoint, as you only have to do 3 quests for about a third of your bar a day. So for Shadowbringers, you're going to want to do the pixies each day, and then when you get into the Endwalker levels, you'll want to do the elephants. And then some point later in Dawn Trail, when they introduce the new battle beast tribe, you'll want to do that as well if you haven't leveled your jobs by then. But with that, let's get into the current in-game levels of Dawn Trail, levels 91 to 100. And believe it or not, the best way to level until about 95 or 97 is by doing the Endwalker Alliance raids. And this is especially true if you have the pre-order earring for Dawn Trail, because a little quirk to the EXP boosting items is they only care about your current level, not your actual level. Meaning if you have a job that is level 94, but you go into, say, Aglaya, which sinks you down to level 90, you actually regain the bonus 30% EXP buff that the earring provides, since you're now technically level 90 or below. But with that little detail covered, let's talk about why the Endwalker Alliance raids, specifically Aglaya, are such a good source of experience. And the simple answer is it just gives good experience at about 10 million plus a run, and it being an alliance raid that people are actively running means it's pretty easy to queue into for a DPS. Now, once you start to get into those later levels, dungeon spam will begin to outpace it, but Aglaya is going to get you most of the way, especially as a DPS. And you can further speed up this process by just doing the fates in Dawn Trail while waiting for your queue to pop. But that's basically it for DPS, so let's talk about tanks and healers. The fact they can get fast queues, the leveling is just much simpler than DPS, as 90% of the leveling process is just dungeon spam. Once you get to Bozja, you can consider doing it, but it's about on par with dungeon spam. Tanks might actually have it a little faster in Bozja, but overall it's not going to be a major difference. As for the final levels, the same rule applies. Do Aglaya until around level 95 without the earring, level 97 with it, and then dungeon spam the last of your levels. Now, I do want to add a bit of future proofing here because we do know we're going to be getting a new adventure foray, which is the same type of content as Bozja, and I assume that they're going to keep the leveling aspect of it. So if that is the case, then that will likely become a fantastic source of leveling once it's introduced, so just keep that in mind. But with that, we've basically covered everything you need to know to help improve your leveling experience. Now, if you found this video helpful, please consider liking it and possibly subscribing to the channel so that you know when I release a new video. Also, consider checking out one of my other guides like this one going over tips for new healers. And if you've made it this far into the video, I want to say thank you for watching and I wish you the best on your leveling journey.